Anyway, so on with the show. Thank you very much for coming to listen to me waffle on about camera stuff. I'm a DP cinematographer and trainer from the UK, but very importantly, I don't work for Sony. Yes, Sony have paid me to come here today to talk to you, but I'm not a Sony employee, despite what many people may think. I do have a very good relationship with Sony, but I don't work for them. I am very much a DP and a shooter. I am actively out shooting stuff on a regular basis. I'm just finishing off a big project for the TV manufacturer Philips to help them launch some new technology a little bit later in the year. All shot in HDR and in 4K. So I've learned a huge amount about HDR as part of that project. I shoot all kinds of things. Many of you may know me for the hurricanes and the tornadoes that I shoot, and Northern Lights, which you've just seen, but I also shoot drama, TV commercials, and a lot of other stuff. Huge variety. I've been in this business for 30 years now, and I've pretty much done just about everything from TV news to all kinds. And this is what I shoot with. So I shoot currently with Sony's A7S and A7R Mark II, the PMW FS5, the FS7, and also Sony's F5 and F55. And it's the F5 and 55 that I'm going to be talking to you about today. And I'm not going to try and sell you the cameras. This isn't about how good these cameras are. We know that already. It's going to be about how to use them, how to get the most out of them, and actually, what the hell is some of this terminology that Sony talk about? What on earth does it mean, and what benefit does it actually potentially offer you as a cinematographer or filmmaker? Now, at this point, I'm actually going to show you another video. You will see a couple of clips that we've seen before. And in this video, it's actually shot with a variety of cameras. It's actually shot with all the cameras that I shoot with. And I'm not going to tell you which shots were done with which. You've got to stay to the end to find out which that is. And I'll show you the video again with some captions. So that's just my way of bribing you to stay till the end, even if you find it really, really boring, which I hope you won't. So if we could switch over the sound, we'll have a look at this video. So that was shot with all of those cameras that I've mentioned in the slides. So why, though? One of the things you'll find when we see this video at the end is that the most common camera was actually the F5 or 55. And why that camera? Well, we have a super 35mm sensor. We all pretty much know what that means these days. High dynamic range, 14 stops. Again, we should know what that means. It means the camera's going to deal really well with very challenging and difficult lighting situations. Our own eyes have a dynamic range of about 15 stops, so we're really getting very close to being able to capture exactly what we can see. We can shoot up to 240 frames, use just about any lens that you want, thanks to the very versatile lens mounting system that they have. Multiple codec choices, which is something I'll touch on in a little bit, and low power consumption. Actually, that's one of the big things, that even though this is a full digital cinema camera, it's relatively low power. It's about 26 watts. A lot of the other digital cinema cameras out there are in the 60 to 80 watt range. And if you travel a lot, which I do, that's a big deal because the limitations and regulations on carrying batteries on airplanes and stuff like that are just getting tougher and tougher. So having a low power camera is really good. It's compact and modular, but the big thing, the real big thing is this. that it has 16-bit linear RAW, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. Just quickly mention this, the ENG kit, so if you want to use it for ENG style shooting, you have that. And of course, as this is a Sony presentation, I have to show you the latest and greatest product, which is the new OLED viewfinder for these cameras, the DVF EL200, which is a full 1920 high-resolution panel, brighter, improved diopter. It really is a significant improvement over the old or the previous OLED viewfinder. Now, these cameras are workhorse cameras. They are being used for all kinds of productions around the world. It's very, very popular with Netflix for their 4K content because you have to shoot in 4K, and your content has to be HDR ready. And the F55 ticks all of Netflix's boxes. One series that I'm a real fan of, if you ever get a chance to watch it, that was shot with these cameras, is The Crown. Absolutely amazing story of our Queen and her life, absolutely beautifully shot. I really think that it was a really well-made TV series. And actually, it's really nice to see Netflix putting all this money into TV production and actually giving us really high-quality programming. Now, one of the things that the camera can do, of course, is record with a compressed codec. Most cameras can do that these days. And the codec that's in this camera is Sony's XAVC, which is based on H.264. Nothing really that revolutionary there, perhaps. But they are using something called picture parameter set in this, which analyzes the scene that you're shooting frame by frame, and then the encoding is actually adjusted on a frame-by-frame basis. Then metadata is written within the file that's then used by the decoder to adjust the decoding to match what you were shooting. And as far as I'm aware, nobody else is doing that at the moment. It's very clever, and it makes the codec particularly efficient and gives you really, really high quality. Now, from version 9 of the firmware of these cameras, a new improved version of XAVC was released, which is class 480. And that actually is based on the bit rate, because if we look down here, we'll see that it's actually 480 megabits per second at 30 frames per second. And I've actually started using this particular codec now for mastering. I am a big fan of ProRes. I use ProRes a lot. Please don't get this wrong. ProRes is a very, very useful tool. We all use it, I'm sure. But class 480 offers me the same quality that I get with ProRes HQ and above, and it's half the size of ProRes. So for storing footage long-term, storing those program masters and everything else, I get the same quality as ProRes, but in a file that's half the size, takes up half as much disk space and things like that. So it's a really good high-end codec, either for capture or for mastering, and Adobe Premiere and most of the NLEs now have the ability to export to it. The other thing about the F55 is it has this enormous color space. So that means it can see colors much more true to life, much closer to what we can see. The F5, FS7, those cameras, although Sony have never actually stated this, based on my own observations, they have a color space that's pretty much the same as the DCI P3 standard. And that's pretty reasonable. That's quite respectable and good enough for the majority of applications. But the F55, they go way, way out here, capturing a lot more tones, and that actually gives you better looking faces, better looking skin tones, things like that. And actually, interestingly, one color that a lot of cameras struggle to reproduce really accurately is the brown that you get on tree trunks and tree bark. And when you look at what an F55 produces, it is more true to life. But coming back to that big differentiator for me, it's 16-bit RAW. Now, RAW, in case you're not aware, is taking the raw information from the sensor without any processing or with very, very minimal processing and recording that. And the 16-bit RAW that the F5 and F55 record is true linear RAW. And I'll explain that in a little bit more depth in a moment. But even though it's this amazing 16-bit file, the RAW is only 960 megabits per second at 24 frames per second. Now, if we think about ProRes at the same frame rate, same resolution, ProRes HQ is 880 megabits per second, and that's a compressed YCBCR file. So we can have RAW in a file that's only a little over 15% larger. So in terms of storage requirements and things like that, it's very little difference between shooting with RAW and ProRes. It's really not a big deal. it's a lot smaller actually than uncompressed HD. So we have a file that's smaller than you get from a typically when you shoot with the Alexa and many of the other cameras that are commonly used. Now, so what does RAW mean? Well, for a start, RAW is inherently efficient because with a conventional video camera, we record either RGB or our component video, which is the correct technical term is YCBCR. So we record 3 signals, one for red, one for green, one for blue, or one for Y, one for CBCR. So we actually record 3 times 4096 by 2160 in the case of 4K. So we're actually recording 26 million values when we record compressed. That's a lot of data, however you look at it. And you have to compress that down then to get a sensible file size. But the sensor in these cameras now, and all of the large sensor cameras, all the Super 35 cameras, with the exception actually of the F65, use a Bayer sensor, or they all use some kind of color filter array over the pixels. So what we have is a chip behind each of these filters. There is a pixel. Now, the pixel itself is a black and white brightness measuring device. So the pixel actually only records brightness information. So we have a pixel under here recording how bright the green is at that point, and we have a pixel under here recording how bright the red is at that point. We only actually need to record one set of 4096 by 2160 values, and then in our computer later on, because we know that pixel is under a green filter, etc., we reconstruct that full YCBCR or RGB image. So to record RAW, we only actually record 8 million values instead of 26 million values. So there's actually less data to compress to start with. So RAW is inherently efficient. It's one of its big advantages. So this is one of the things that we do, but in addition to that, Sony used some very special algorithms to take that raw data and make it smaller still, and this is how we get down to these very, very small bit rates, even though this is 16-bit. And here's some examples of some of the bit rates that you've got, and we can see that the F55 RAW is here, and if you compare that to something like Cinema DNG, these are really, really big files. And anybody that's used an FS7 or an FS5 with an Atomos recorder or something like that recording Cinema DNG will know how hard those files are to deal with in post-production. Now, last year, Sony introduced this. This is the R7 memory recorder, and I'm going to skip through some of these slides fairly quickly. And this replaces or supersedes the old R5 recorder that you had for recording RAW. Again, we're recording RAW 16-bit linear, the same as the R5, but we also now with this recorder have the ability to record using new cards, new media at higher bit rates and do a lot more interesting things. Now, something about the R7 is you do actually need to have these AXS A series cards to use it. The old recorder uses these size of cards. But these are actually very similar in size to S/S, and as you'll see in a minute, that has some benefits. The new card reader, the AR1, takes the AXS A series cards and S/S cards. So we can take both types of cards now in one reader, and this is really fast, 9.6 gigabits per second transfer speed. So that'll copy about an hour of raw footage to an SSD, and the bottleneck is likely to be your SSD, in around about 10 minutes. So this thing is really super fast. Now, DITs working on sets, managing a lot of data, are really going to find that really easy. Now, this for me is really important, being able to use both S/S and AXS cards, because one of the clever things about the F55 and the R5 or R7 RAW recorder is that without any extra tools, you can record RAW and full HD at the same time, and the files have the same file names. So we have the ability to record both the RAW on the RAW recorder, either the R5 or the R7, and then in the camera record a really high quality HD file. And this makes post-production really easy because you don't even need at the edit stage to have to deal with the raw. You can do all of your editing with that HD file, and that can have a burnt-in or baked-in look if you wish, so the editor isn't looking at flat, washed-out log footage or raw. He's going to look at a nice, colourful, vivid, vibrant image when he does his editing. Might help him make his edit decisions better, and that's how I do a lot of my productions. So on top of that as well, if you don't have the RAW recorder, you can actually record both 4K and HD in the camera simultaneously, so you have a similar type of workflow. But one of the things the R7 does bring is a new recording format from Sony, which is X-OCN. And we're going to start seeing this format in a lot of cameras coming from Sony, not just the F5 and 55. X-OCN, and I don't quite know where Sony come up with some of these names, but it stands for Extended Tonal Range Original Camera Negative. What a mouthful. Basically, they're saying really good quality. So it takes advantage of another algorithm from Sony that allows us to take 16-bit linear data, which is what makes the 16-bit RAW so good, and make it even smaller. And that allows us to have very, very compact files with really no loss of quality. The file size is actually very, very similar to ProRes or even XAVC. X-OCN, two standards of it. There's ST and LT, and frankly, it's really hard visually to tell the difference between these two, even pushing it really hard in post-production. And X-OCN LT is about the same size as XAVC. So in terms of file size and everything else, it's pretty similar to what you currently use now, perhaps, to do your shooting with. So you don't have to have big, fast RAID arrays. Your archiving is really simple. It's really, really easy. You do need to use the new AXS A cards, which is a bit of a shame. So if you are coming from an R5, you do have to get new cards. Just to give you an idea of some file sizes here, another wonderful slide from Sony. But the X-OCN we have up here, teeny tiny files compared to, let's have a look. So even where's ProRes is sort of somewhere out here, actually. ProRes is pretty big. Here we go, it's ProRes. So ProRes is here, and X-OCN, where have they hidden it? Anyway, the X-OCN is the red one. It's a really compact file. In fact, this is the ST, the LT is even smaller. So really, really good. But what's so good about 16-bit linear? Why is it that we want 16-bit linear data? Well, the real world, the light in the real world is linear. If you want to make your scene brighter by a stop, if you want to double the light in your scene, well, you have to double up your lights. So if you start off with 2 lights and you want to make your scene twice as bright, you add 2 more. If you then want to make that scene twice as bright again, you now have to add 4 more lights, and then 8 and 16 and so on. And that is how linear records the world. It actually, each time we go up a stop in brightness, we actually double the amount of data that we allocate to each of those stops. And we're talking with 16-bit, huge amounts of data. 8-bit recording, only 235 shades from black to white. 10-bit recording, 1,024. Well, in fact, in reality, it's only 970 shades from black to white. With 16-bit linear, it's 65,000 shades from black to white. This is a tremendous uplift in the amount of data you've got, especially in the brighter parts of the image. And that's going to become really important for a lot of us when we start doing HDR. In the past, we've got away with 10-bit and 8-bit because generally the display technology hasn't been able to show what we're recording. The cameras have typically actually been much, much better than the displays that we've got. But that is now changing. The display technology in the last couple of years has come on leaps and bounds. It's catching up, and it's able to reproduce real-world scenes with real-world brightness. So we no longer have the ability to fudge it. We can't capture 14 stops, but only show it on a 6-stop screen. Now we're going to be capturing 14 stops and showing it on a 10 or 12 stop screen. We're not going to be able to get away with things that we used to get away with. Now, if we think about log for a minute, which a lot of people shoot with now, and please don't take this wrong, I will continue to shoot with log. Log definitely has a place. That's what you're recording with log compared to 16-bit linear. So as we go up each stop, once we go above middle gray, each stop is actually recorded with the same amount of data. So there is very, very little information in the highlights. If we take these brighter stops up here, that with 16-bit are recorded with something like 30,000 levels, 30,000 code values, with 10-bit log, they're only recorded using 300 or 400 code values. A huge difference. This is also what we call scene referred, because traditional shooting with 709 and stuff like that is actually based around what it looks like on those old TVs that most of us still have that can only show a very limited range. So everything was referred back to making it look nice on the TV. But when we start shooting with linear, because we are capturing the way the world really is, we call this scene referred, because our capture should be a precision measurement of the scene. It's no longer log, which is throwing away highlight data. It's no longer 709, which doesn't have any highlight data. This should be a true measurement of what we are shooting pixel for pixel. So it's scene referred. It's all about capturing the scene to our best ability. Now, from a practical standpoint, what does it really mean? So this is an interesting example. So what this is one of the frames from the video you saw. And this was shot with my F5 camera, and it was shot 16-bit linear raw, as well as 10-bit log internal on the camera. So we have the linear here and the log here with a like-for-like grade. These are graded to look identical on the screen. Now, obviously, one is linear, one is log, so there are a few slight differences in the actual settings that were applied to get to this state. What you perhaps might be able to just about see is actually in the highlights. These are really smooth here in the 16-bit, and they're not quite as smooth with the log. Now let's dig into this a little bit more closely. These are the waveforms, linear and log. And some of you can probably already start to see that there is a difference in the highlights. Now, the shot, and I'm going to just be honest here, I'm not going to try and pretend that it hasn't really been pushed in post. That shot had a dynamic range of around about 14 or 15 stops. It was a cloud, very, very dark at the bottom, that brilliant bright sunlight from the sunset at the top. And with traditional exposure with log, those highlights don't contain a lot of information. All your information is really going to be in the mid-range, but with linear, those highlights contain a staggering amount of information. So when you grade it to really pull out the detail in those highlights, the linear is going to behave so much better. And if we go in even closer to the waveform, you can see some huge differences in here. The 16-bit linear after grading is all lovely and smooth. We have nice textures in here. The 10-bit log is really starting to pull apart. You've got all these little banding artifacts, and that's simply there isn't enough data. So as you stretch it out in the grade, you get gaps. And in the finished shot, the log looks coarser. It doesn't look as smooth and silky like the 16-bit linear raw does. And this is why I really love shooting with linear raw, that the information that you have in those highlights is incredible. There is no highlight roll-off. You go up and up and up in exposure until you hit the clipping point of the sensor. There's no shadow roll-off either. You are recording everything as it truly is. What you really want to do when you expose with linear is expose really brightly. As I showed you in that graph earlier, there is a ton of data in those brighter stops. I've seen examples of shots where I don't know how it was shot, to be honest, it was a complete mess, but they've exposed it 4 or 5 stops brighter than they intended to. When you look at it converted to 709 directly, the screen is just white. But when you dig down into that data, you can actually recover a perfectly usable and actually very good-looking shot. So if you expose with linear raw, don't be afraid to really expose nice and brightly, because that's where the good data is. That's how you get your fat negative, by being nice and bright. And a nice bright exposure is going to mean less noise, because in post-production, if anything, they're going to be bringing levels down, which then also reduces noise. And that then gives you more latitude for grading in post. And even that top stop, where normally we'd be really scared of shooting with anything clipped. You look at the waveform on your camera while you're shooting and you see clipping and you go into panic mode. Oh my God, it's clipped. Remember, that top stop, the one that's clipping, contains as much data as the entire rest of your scene. in terms of what you're recording. So even though it might be a little bit clipped, there is still great data there that you will be able to recover. So don't worry about having clipped highlights, because even with HDR, there still aren't screens that can show those highlights truly as they are. So don't panic if you have a little bit of clipping in your highlights. So what I'm going to do quickly is to go through real-world workflow with you and how I shoot with RAW and log, because one of the things I was really nervous about when I started thinking about going to shooting with RAW was dealing with it in post. How hard was it going to be? Now, with the RAW or the X-OCN, we have this XAVC HD proxy in the camera. That proxy, as I mentioned already, can be S-Log2, or you can bake in a LUT. The camera has a number of LUTs built in that you can bake in, or you can create a stylized look, load it into the camera and bake that in for post. So that's what I do. And that gives me two files then in post-production, a really easy to work with HD file, as well as my larger, but still quite easy to work with RAW file. And then I edit, or the editors that I work with will normally edit the XAVC HD file just because it's easy, it's simple and fast. And when you're editing, it's all about flow. You want to be able to just hit that spacebar, play it back, and it play back smoothly. And then once the edit is locked in, locked down, we then grade using the RAW or the X-OCN files using a color managed workflow. And I'll look at those right now for you. So let me just come out of my slides. I'm just going to go into DaVinci Resolve. I have to say I'm a die-hard Adobe user, been using it for many, many years. But DaVinci Resolve, this is the beta of version 14. This has really come a long way now. And I'm actually considering shifting my entire workflow now to Resolve, doing the editing within Resolve. Normally what I would do is I would edit in Premiere, lock down the edit in Premiere, and then from Premiere export an XML file. Very simple to do. You just select your timeline, export XML. And then when you go into Resolve or your grading package, you would just go File, Import XML, and then import that XML file. And it's almost like magic. Your project will appear in Resolve, and then you can grade it within Resolve. Now, I've got a few clips here that I selected previously, and these are all 16-bit linear RAW files. So these are 960 megabit per second files. And just to really sort of show you how easy it is to work with, I'm just going to do a very quick edit. Let's just drop a few files into the timeline. And I want particularly to look at this one because there's some stuff in this I want to show you in a moment. So this is a MacBook Pro laptop. Yes, it's about a 4-year-old one. It's not the very, very latest one, but it does have a fairly good graphics card in it. But it allows me, here we are, where's the guy running down the stairs, to actually work directly with the RAW smoothly and easily. I'm not doing any clever tricks or anything to do this. I'm playing back 16-bit RAW. Try and do that with Cinema DNG files. It's not going to happen on a laptop. But the way Sony encode and process the file is done in a way that's very sympathetic with processors, so they can decode it very easily, and it gives you the ability to use quite modest computers to deal with this footage. Okay, so here we have a few clips in my timeline. I can now go to my grading window, and we can start grading the clips. Now, at the moment, my workflow is a conventional workflow, and one of the things that happens when you shoot RAW is that if you set the camera to S-Log2 or to S-Log3, when you bring the footage into post, it's decoded and converted to the same S-Log that you selected in the camera. So this was actually S-Log3 in camera, so it's being converted to S-Log3 for playback. Now, RAW doesn't actually have a gamma curve, it's linear. But this is just done as a convenience thing, just to give you a starting point for your grading. So we have S-Log3, and that kind of pushes us into a corner a little bit because we now have log footage to grade. So we've got to start thinking about lookup tables and things like that. So I could very simply, in fact, what I'll do is add a global LUT to my output. And if I go to my color management here, I'm just very quickly going to put a S-Log3 to 709 LUT on this. And as if by magic, it's kind of halfway there to being done. It's very easy, very simple. So that's one approach that we can use to work with our footage, is applying a LUT. It works. I've got nothing against using LUTs really, but LUTs are far from perfect. They can often force you into a corner with your look because you're seeing a stylized look straight away. And one of the other things, actually, let me put the LUT back on if I can very quickly, is you get some very strange behavior with log footage. If I use the gain control here, which would normally you expect to be sort of very similar to an exposure control, is that as I change the gain control, the image actually becomes flatter. If I go up in gain, it becomes more contrasty. And that's because we're applying a linear correction to log. Makes it difficult to deal with. So it's not ideal. So what I tend to do now is use a color managed workflow. And there's various options with this. One of them is ACES, which is the Academy of Motion Pictures workflow. And the other one that we have in this particular package is DaVinci Resolve's own color managed. So if I quickly go in here and we go to the master project settings, there is a setting here I can choose between DaVinci YRGB, which is our conventional workflow, and these color managed workflows. Now, very quickly, I'm going to go to ACES, and then in my color management, I'm simply going to tell DaVinci Resolve that this was shot with Sony RAW, and I want to output it in 709 because this is a 709 projector. Click Save, and we'll wait for the computer to catch up because ACES is incredibly processor hungry. So ACES works really well. We get this lovely instant look, works with most cameras. There's input transforms for most cameras. It works, but it's really, really processor intensive. And actually trying to run that on this laptop is difficult. If I try and play this now, it's barely going to do it. So while ACES has a lot of benefits, and I do like the ACES workflow, what I tend to do is to use DaVinci's own workflow. And if I go to DaVinci Color Managed, and I go to my color management, all I really need to do is what I'm going to set up here. I'm going to have a linear timeline, because linear gives me my full 16-bit data, 16-bit color. And again, Rec 709 for the output, and click Save. And it looks very similar to the ACES. That's what we would expect. We are converting from the RAW to 709, and we would expect both ACES and Blackmagic to behave very similar. But the difference is if I click play, it works, because this is designed for this platform very, very good. And it gets me very close to where I want to be, my finished images. And I can now, my gain control actually becomes much more of an exposure control. You can see how it really changes the exposure because we are working with linear footage in a linear timeline, and we are applying linear controls. Everything is matched. And actually, this is one of the really nice things about linear data, is it's very intuitive for grading. It behaves in a sensible way. Log can do some really strange things sometimes. You pull the mid-range down and the highlights blow out, or you try and balance it out because with a log curve, your shadow range and your highlight range are different. They're recorded in a different way, so they behave differently. But with linear, the whole range from black to the brightest highlight is all the same, so it all behaves the same, and that makes it really easy to grade. And of course, it's 16-bit as well, so you have 16-bit color, so the amount of information you have is staggering. And just to have a look at that in terms of how much information do we have. So this was shot in Myanmar, and they have this golden temple in Myanmar, very, very famous right here, and this was at sunset. This is a really quite a challenging shot. Now, if we zoom in a bit here, this temple has a really big highlight on it, and the camera has actually really hung on to that highlight really very, very well. If I bring my exposure down using my gain control, if I go down far enough, you can actually see that that is not overexposed. The camera's actually managed to capture that. Because it's 16-bit linear data, there is a tremendous amount of information in that highlight, and if I wanted to, I could add a power window and things like that to hold on to that highlight, and it would look really, really good. So we have huge benefits with recording this. If I go the other way, if I bring my levels up, there is a tremendous amount of picture information in these shadows here. We can see everything that's going on. So it's a really just a beautiful format to work with. And if we now go back to our lovely young lady, again, in this example here, this is backlit. There was a setting sun coming through the windows of the room that this was shot in. We have a red-haired girl, really vibrant colored hair, and you get that lovely highlight in her hair. And if I bring the exposure down, you can see that we can go way, way down, and there is a ton of information in there. Now, who here does green screen? Stuff like this is a nightmare to key with normal codecs and things like that, because those highlights and those fine hairs very often have very little data, very little contrast in there. Makes them really difficult to key. But with 16-bit linear, there is a ton of information, even in something that perhaps, if I go back to the base settings, you would think that's never going to key. It's all overexposed. That doesn't look very good. But when you start digging down into the data and digging down into what you've actually got with 16-bit recordings, it really is quite remarkable what is in there and what you can pull out of that data. So really that sort of concludes the presentation aspect for today. As you can see, I'm a huge fan of this 16-bit linear data. All types of RAW are not created equal. That's something very important to understand. Sony are not unique, but they focus on linear RAW with their cameras. Other manufacturers may use log RAW, and log RAW has many of the same limitations of log recording, that those bright highlights just don't have huge amounts of data. So if you do start digging down into them or even stretching them out for an HDR display, you are going to run into problems. And actually, there was one more thing that I did almost forgot, was why use a color managed workflow? What benefits does this bring me? Well, a very important one. If we just do a little grade on a couple of these, or just fiddle around with them a little bit. Let's bring up the saturation. Here we go. Gotta love 16-bit color. Is in the future, we're going to have to start delivering in multiple standards. Right now, it's really simple for most of us. We are delivering in one standard, either 709 for television or DCI P3 for digital cinema. That's all going to change because of HDR, high dynamic range. If you haven't heard of it, haven't seen it, you must have had your head in the sand, because everywhere you go these days, it's everywhere. But one of the real beauties of this color managed workflow is that, so let's say I've graded this to produce my HDR version, and I've made it all look nice and sexy in standard dynamic range, and that's not nice and sexy, that's horrible. That light is, there we go. So we've done a bit of grading, tweaked it, and now we've delivered this to, let's say, the terrestrial broadcaster, but now we've made the big time. We've sold it to Netflix, who are going to pay us huge sums of money, I wish, for this footage, and they want it in HDR. Now, with a traditional workflow, if I'd done this using the YRGB workflow, that basically would have meant going back to the drawing board and regrading it and starting again. But with a color managed workflow, I can simply go to my color management, and instead of outputting everything as 709, I can go down here and I can output my production as Rec 2100 ST2084, which is HDR 10 standard. The current primer, there's two standards at the moment for HDR, but this is the one that's the prevalent one right now. Click Save, and that would look fantastic on an HDR screen. That gets you that initial HDR version. Now, you would want to go through it and tweak it and adjust it a little bit. I'm not saying it is just as simple as clicking that thing, that setting, but if I was to show you this on an HDR TV now, it would look correct. It wouldn't be optimum, but it would look correct. And you'd just go through and tweak your highlights a little bit to bring up some of those highlights and make it really sparkle on the HDR screen. Perhaps then, though, Netflix rejects your show and say, actually, we don't want it. And the BBC come to you, or NRK in Norway and a few other terrestrial broadcasters, and say, well, we would like it, but we want it in HDR in hybrid log gamma, which is the other standard. Well, it's no big deal. It's no big drama. because we just go here and we go to hybrid log gamma and we click OK. And surprisingly, actually, it now kind of looks okay, because hybrid log gamma is backwards compatible with standard dynamic range. So hybrid log gamma allows you to create content that will work both on an HDR screen and on an SDR screen, which is why this looks correct again. So what happens with hybrid log gamma is actually it works very similar to a hyper gamma or a cine gamma in the camera, and it compresses the highlights. So on a 709 TV, a normal TV, it looks like you shot with some fancy gamma curve with a bit of highlight compression, so you kind of see the highlights sort of squashed together a little bit. Then the HDR TV with hybrid log gamma in it takes that highlight range and it expands it back out again, giving you the HDR image. So this is becoming quite common amongst a lot of terrestrial broadcasters that are looking into HDR productions. So a really great way to go. So that is the end of the presentation. To finish, I will just show you that video of the same one as the beginning, but there will be a caption on it now, tell you which shots were shot with which cameras. This was a video I showed at NAB. At NAB, we had the CLED screen, which I can't remember how big it was. It was bigger than this, and that was HDR, and I'm really pleased with the way it came out in HDR. I will take questions afterwards, but I won't take them here. Just as a courtesy to the next guys that are coming in to do their seminar, I will quite happily answer your questions outside once I've packed up the camera that's at the back. So if you've got any questions, anything you want to know more about, I'll answer those outside. So let's just show you that video to wrap up. Let me just come out of Resolve. Thank you very much.